Kind of to go back, 4 years and give some background. We, 4 years ago, we had what you might refer to as a complicated mess of interconnected Excel spreadsheets that was used to calculate our allowance. At that time, our chief credit officer was actually retiring, and so collectively, we determined that it might be better to begin to think about automating that process. Lots of benefits come from that, right? Streamlined calculation, faster delivery times, certainly more robust internal control environment. And so we did. Really after, and I would say, careful evaluation and meticulous questioning of multiple vendors. We beat the vendors up pretty hard. Actually, MST was in our top 3 as well, but we did choose Sageworks. No offense to MST, they were in our top 3. But anyways, we also were aware, I guess, of the fact that, that 4-letter acronym CECL and the need to begin to gather that historical loan level data. And we really felt that Sageworks would provide that platform, again, 4 years ago, to really begin to build that historical data. So at the time, we had loaded 3 years of historical data. So we have data going back to 2012. And since 2015, we've really been able to turn our calculation around in 1 business day, which provides kind of our chief credit officer the ability to kind of review the calculation, review the Q factors, and kind of sit down with our allowance committee and really, decide and conclude on the allowance on the 2nd business day, which allows us to close on the 3rd business day. So that's where we're at. And as the corporate controller at the bank, that makes me very happy. I like to close early, or not early, that's on time, rather. But certainly we've got a number of deadlines. Our earnings release gets filed within 2 weeks after the end of the quarter. Our 10-Qs, we're obviously a public company, are getting filed within 3-4 weeks thereafter. So it's very important for us that we can have a quick close. So fast forward a couple of years. So early 2017, we formed a CECL implementation team that was made up of various individuals throughout our bank, and those included really, accounting, risk management, credit, asset liability management, loan ops, and IT, right? And then we kind of have this side group, part of IT, which is called like the data group, and they've actually been really helpful with this implementation. But we also formed an oversight committee that's made up of executives, other stakeholders like internal audit, maybe loan reviews on that group, and that group meets monthly. I failed to mention that our core implementation team has been meeting weekly since really the beginning of 2017. So we've been working pretty diligently on a number of things, and I'll get into that here in a minute. And while I'm talking, deadlines and reporting, we've also provided our board with kind of a CECL education session, if you will, and we've also provided them with a couple of updates along the way, kind of updating them on our progress to date. So, after we formed this core implementation team, we really begin to explore options on how do we implement CECL. Where do we even start, right? I mean, there's so much. Where do you begin? One thing that we're very familiar with is something called a gap analysis. I'm sure that many of you have performed a gap analysis or had a consultant maybe perform a gap analysis to kind of really identify issues or gaps in like a new method or model that you're implementing. We saw this a good bit with our DFAST implementation. Of course, DFAST is gone, thank God. So what we did is we actually kind of said, okay, we're going to start this process by performing a gap analysis. Very simple. Well, maybe not so much, but do we perform this in-house? Do we hire a third-party consultant? There's a lot of consultants out there, a lot of third parties that are willing to, charge a lot of money to do this type of gap assessment. Absolutely. We had 4 or 5 of them come in. The other option would have been to take some kind of hybrid approach where we do a little bit and maybe a consultant does a little bit. We do what we're comfortable with and we have a consultant do what's left, kind of. We really did feel, though, that based on the complexity of the CECL standard, we didn't want to kind of go it alone. We really felt that it was necessary for our organization to receive some kind of support, particularly on the gaps, the model documentation, the segmentation, and just overall the calculation. We did reach out to multiple vendors from a variety of backgrounds, including Sageworks, and really to just understand what's available from a gap analysis perspective. And through that process, we were introduced to Garver Moore, and one of the first things that really caught our attention was a sample of the data gap analysis that he had run on our C&I portfolio. And this was in the proposal stage. He basically said, look, we can, we'll take a look at your C&I portfolio. We'll run some data gap analysis on it, and we'll just kind of see what kicks out. So, a week later, it only took a week. He runs this sample on our C&I portfolio, and as he's going through and showing us some of the gaps, I have to tell you, I think my co-team lead, who's sitting in the back there, along with myself, were scribbling down notes as fast as we possibly could because we had identified right there 4 or 5 important gaps that really were going to impact us from a CECL perspective. Nothing impacting us from an incurred loss perspective, so you can all rest assured there. But nevertheless, so we really ultimately did like what we saw, and we felt that it would be a good fit for West Banco to move forward with Sageworks in a consulting capacity. Number of reasons. For one, they're basically 3 steps ahead of any other consultant, simply because they had 5 years of our historical loan level data. But not only that, the modeling capabilities, certainly the segmentation and loss driver analysis that they pitched as well. It was all great stuff, and we recognized really that we could leverage the knowledge and expertise of these guys to help us along. We don't have the time. By no means, we've invested, I can't tell you how many hours into this, but we would not have been able to do it to the right satisfaction without these guys, so we're very appreciative of that. Another thing that, another item, we really felt that, going with like a Sageworks really put us in a position to respond to changes in the future as well, right? So raise your hand if you think that the FASB is going to modify CECL in the next 5 years. I mean, right? Maybe the TRG comes out with something, who knows? I don't know if anybody attended the AICPA banking conference just last week. I think Gordon had mentioned it. I don't know if he's in here or not, but I think I had heard that the FASB was actually considering making some major modifications. They opened the door in the AICPA banking conference last week. We're 2 years into the standard, and some banks potentially could be early adopting as early as Jan 1 of 2019. So anyways, another good reason why we wanted to have some of that support from someone, and that someone was Sageworks. Again, another item here, the SOC 1 was really appealed to us. I know our auditors love SOC 1s. I don't know about you guys, but SOC 1s are really important to them. And, given that there are a number of highly complex kind of mathematical calculations, that provides us, certainly at a minimum, and I believe personally, both the auditors and model validators, really a baseline of internal control. So what we're talking about here is, ultimately more efficient processes for all parties involved. So I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful that we're going to actually receive a reduction in our audit fees because we've got a SOC 1 from Sageworks. But nevertheless, that's the point is we're going to receive. There's going to be value down the road there for sure because they're going to be able to rely on some of the mechanics of the model. I'm not suggesting the data because it's our responsibility to make sure that data is right. And if you get the data wrong, you've got major problems. But I'm also not suggesting that you've got to have the assumptions right as well. But certainly that SOC one, it was big. And then finally, I would say, I'm personally a big fan of the concept of safety in numbers, right? Does anybody, safety in numbers? I think that's wonderful. I know that there's obviously several hundred other banks that are on this platform. It really provides auditors and regulators, in my opinion, some comfort as well. I think it would be difficult, again, for one to challenge the mechanics, certainly the mechanics, when there's several hundred others that are on the same platform and all other auditors or regulators have already approved the mechanics. So those were kind of the big points for why we went that direction. I wanted to walk through the proposal now quickly here. Again, this was an engagement separate and apart from the software. This was really a consulting, engagement. And the scope of the engagement really covered, 6 or 7 key areas. And those include the data gap analysis, loss driver analysis, segmentation analysis, the prepayment analysis, 3 measurements of the quantitative calculation, and then the overall model documentation, which is really kind of where it all comes together. And so, just to dive a little bit deeper into each of these, and starting with the gap analysis, we really broke our gap assessment into 2 pieces, 2 primary components. One was data, which was primarily performed by the Sageworks team, Garver, and his team in particular, and then the other really was kind of the all other bucket that basically covered things like governance, internal controls, processes, and then all things securities, right? So that's how we broke our gap assessment down. The data gap assessment that was performed by Sageworks, it was excellent. It really was the first deliverable that we received under the engagement. It surfaced a number of unusual items to investigate and really gave us a jump start and some direction on how and where to begin, right? I mean, this is like the starting point almost. You've got to start somewhere. They also provide us with a matrix, and I'm sure that many of you have probably seen this, but it kind of laid out each data element and whether it was critical to the various modeling methodologies, vintage, DCF, roll rate, et cetera. And we were able to kind of use that to determine basically prioritize those data gaps and then really begin working on them one by one to basically, document our conclusions and the corrections that we've made. The way we prioritize them, we really looked at it in 2 ways. First, the data integrity. Second, importance. So we basically came up with this pretty simple 3-tiered scale, high, medium, and low, and said, okay, this data element, is it important to the calculation? Again, we could see by column, DCF, roll rate, vintage, what it was going to be important towards. So we ranked each data element by importance on a high, medium, low scale, ranked each data element by data integrity. Data integrity is really the important one because we've got, I don't know, probably 250, 300 fields in our core. I would venture to guess, well, I won't disclose my confidence level in all 300 of those fields, okay? At least not publicly. But I know that we've got the right ones, for the most part, are there, but maybe not so much to cover CECL. But so that's kind of what we did. And I would say, in hindsight, if your experience is anything like ours, whatever amount of time you budgeted or figured to spend on data gaps, just go ahead and double it. I mean, that's the reality. That's the reality that we face for sure. I mean, you find some gaps, some data elements that they came from some former acquisition, and they did something one way, and it's a maturity date, or it's an estimated maturity date, who knows? And you suddenly find this population of loans that have one thing that's different about them, and you ask why, and then you realize, oh, it's related to that acquisition. They must have done something different. So that's an easier fix. The harder fixes are things that are happening really in current practice. When loan operations is inputting the loans today, we have to make sure that we're going in and changing those processes to make sure that they're putting the right information in, as they're boarding the loans. And that's where really we found some of that time has been in the data gap assessment. The next item here, the loss driver analysis and selection of economic indicators. This is a big one here as well. This was detailed analysis really on how our portfolio correlates to key economic indicators, really to determine which economic indicators should really drive our reasonable and supportable forecast. And so, this deliverable came as about a 30-page memo, documented the process that the Sageworks team went through. It included correlation analysis to West Banco's historical loss rates, and it really quantified the impact of really these key economic variables such as unemployment, GDP, housing price index, CPI, retail sales. They covered, I think, 20 key economic metrics in total, and they looked at those both at the state level as well as the national level. Again, they compared these by portfolio segment, and the results really ultimately for us indicated that national unemployment was actually the most highly correlated among all of our segments. But we also noticed some interesting facts as well, one being that the Ohio Housing Price Index just happened to be highly correlated to our resi portfolio. I don't know, maybe that was a coincidence. We are in 5 states, not one, but Ohio is kind of the central state relative to our footprint. I mean, all the other 4 states border Ohio. We're not going to use Ohio Housing Price Index to drive our forecast for resi portfolio, but nevertheless, I thought it was an interesting observation, and it's the kind of work that we're getting, the kind of work product that we're getting. Another one was movements in prime were highly correlated to our C&I portfolio. That's probably reasonable, So again, like I said, this was performed by portfolio segment and really provided us with the ability to conclude on the economic indicators that we plan to use to support our forecast, but it also provides really a solid foundation. If one were to come in and challenge how we determine the economic indicators and drivers of loss, we've got a ton of support, a 30-page memo backing this up. National unemployment. The next deliverable was the segmentation analysis. Here we, internally, our core implementation team discussed alternatives to segmentation. The Sageworks team also looked at, our portfolio to determine if there were any ways that might make sense to segment. They basically kind of ran a couple different scenarios to determine really if there's a better way or a more statistically valid way to segment the portfolio that ultimately, supported the segmentation that was chosen, backed up by statistical analysis and solid evidence. So again, this was a 15-page memo. It was generated by Sageworks, provided us, really provided, documented the exercise and the corresponding results. And this was really used as a decisioning tool for our core team as well as our executives to really provided some substance behind the rationale for the segmentation. So we feel like we've got a nice solid foundation to support the segmentation that we've developed. Model selection, real quick here. There was a lot of work done on this as well. Won't beat it up too much. We ultimately did decide on a DCF calculation. We really felt that we liked the idea and having the ability and the granularity to drill down into the loan level to understand kind of how each loan is contributing to the allowance. Also, we felt that there was really the most visibility there, and I think Nikas and probably Tim and Garver have all kind of pounded that a little bit as well. So, we did like that. We also, obviously, with acquired portfolios, that's how we value the portfolio, right? A DCF calculation. That's the time-tested method. So that's ultimately what we concluded there. With respect to the prepayment analysis, again, this was really used to support the DCF calculation. Again, the advisory folks really calculated prepayment speeds and curtailment rates based on our own portfolio. This was another 15 to 20 page memo documenting the method calculating the results. And this, again, was by portfolio segment. This is actually an area where we might be able to save some money in the future because our ALM team actually receives prepayment speed calculations from outside third party that they pay for. So we might be able to kind of kill two birds with one stone, in this way, so we can see some cost savings here. The quantitative calculation, this is a big one here. 3 measures of the quantitative portion of the CECL model. I mean, they were looking at some impact analysis, some alternative segmentation, drivers of loss, as well as, kind of like a baseline model versus maybe a more severe approach to really sensitize the model and provide us, with some initial guidance. At this point, we've run 2 iterations of our 3. And with each iteration, we've kind of sat down with their team for about 2 hours, talked through kind of, the assumptions, the impacts, and really the sensitivity to the various scenarios that they ran through those impacts. Eventually, we'll take that over. We're kind of in that process now. And then finally, the model documentation. This is really where it all comes together. We've been working on this for several months, and this is where all the decisions, the separate memos supporting all those decisions gets really pulled into one place. We really envision 2 sets of documentation, one sort of a more permanent over like the initial build of the model. It's probably not going to change very often. And then another set of documentation that's more focused on the quarterly allowance and the assumptions that need to go in on a quarterly basis. Again, the advisory team is going to be pulling together a good portion of this documentation for us. And, this is obviously really a huge deliverable. Like I said, we're ultimately going to take ownership of this. However, we're going to continue to tweak kind of these master documents, but it certainly provides us with, it's an end point, but it's also a starting point that we can work off of, really saving us just a ton of time. And you can really see, between 6, 7 deliverables, with 20-page memos attached with each deliverable, you can very easily end up with a 200 or 300-page document just documenting the model, not including all of the documentation that we have over our data that we've been working on. So, it happened in small chunks. I'm not going to say, and Garber's team really has been responsible for a good portion of that. But we could see some serious documentation. It's going to be, I challenge the auditors and the regulators to read that documentation. Sometimes you can just kind of like kill them with over information, right? So it looks like I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to skip over a few areas. Next steps for us: finalize the quantitative calculation. Certainly, we're planning to really do that in the 4th quarter. Design the Q factors starting in the 4th quarter into the 1st quarter. 1st quarter, we hope to finalize basically our policies and procedures over the governance of the model, and then we're planning to run parallel for 4 quarters in 2019. And when I say parallel, I mean a full parallel run, including internal audit. We're going to have our external auditors look at it in the 1st quarter of 2019. We want the model validators in. We want the chief credit officer, our CFO reviewing the calculation, and we want to do all of that for all 4 quarters within the time frames of our normal close. So we are going to do this on a 1-month lag. We're not going to try to throw this in with our normal, kind of 1st quarter close. So we'll be doing it May 1st as opposed to kind of April 1st. Challenges, real quick, that we've experienced to date. Obviously, data. I'm sure that many of you are going to experience the same. We've been working through this slowly. Particularly, like I said, those that are more acquisitive in nature probably are going to find more anomalies. But we've also found a number of items related specifically to our own legacy portfolio. As we've changed policies and procedures over the years. We've got loans that have been on the books for 20 years, and policies and procedures have been changing since then. So we found some items there. Alignment with other internal forecasts. This is probably primarily related to prepayment speeds, particularly the fact that our ALM group has a set of prepayment speeds. Now we've got prepayment speeds from Sageworks. I think it's great because we can kind of use both of them to validate one another, but at the same time, to the extent that you have differences, it has been a very difficult time trying to document the reasons why you have differences. And sometimes there are valid reasons, there are really good reasons, but you have to understand how that third party is coming up with the prepayment speed as well as how Sageworks is coming up with it, and then try to mesh the two together. So that's another reason why I'm okay with killing two birds with one stone. And then finally, I would say loans with no contractual maturity date. This is something that I think that the FASB and TRG really need to just take up. We've got a number of commercial loans. They're on demand, lines of credit, no contractual maturity date. We've heard three different approaches. One is taking the credit card approach. Another is look at the history, the weighted average life over your history to come up with an estimated life. And really the third approach that we've heard is look, maybe you should only be, the life of that loan should be basically the period of time that you're exposed to the credit risk. This is kind of an abstract thought, but it's interesting, and it's actually, I don't know why it slipped my mind, but this is one that we're actually thinking about potentially adopting. So the idea here is, so we've got loans that go on forever. They've been paying principal, or they've been paying interest for 40 years, and they're going to continue on. So the concept here is for the commercial loans, we do a full underwriting every single year. So we're exposed to the credit risk. The theory is we're exposed to the credit risk for a year. So maybe the life of the loan should be 1 year, and then maybe plus some call or redemption period, 30 or 90 days, whatever. But that would be the amount of time you're exposed. And we've actually talked to a couple of our peer banks, and this is the method that they're using right now in lieu of some guidance from the FASB or the TRG. So I think that wraps it up. A couple minutes behind here. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Do you foresee, while you're running concurrent in 19, do you foresee any Q disclosures?
Yeah, so SAB 74 disclosures from our perspective, I mean, we're definitely not planning to lead the charge. We're thinking probably second quarter, third quarter at best of next year is when we would start doing that. I mean, I could go into a lot of details on what my thoughts are. I think coming up with a range is pretty simple to do. I know there's been a lot of surveys by Big Four accounting firms, ABA, et cetera, where they've talked a lot about, surveys of banks, what do you expect your increase in your allowance to be? Somewhere between 0 and 50% seems to be, that sounds like now maybe it's a lot less than that. Maybe it's 30%, maybe it's, 20%, I don't know. But I did, we looked at kind of a sensitivity analysis on our own portfolio because we had some concerns, what's the impact to our capital ratios? What's the impact to equity? We're going to have this one-time charge. It's going to, what's it going to do? We should be concerned. Well, we ran this calculation pretty quickly. And actually, I reported it to our board last year. If you take a real quick example, I know we're out of time, but we have an allowance of $50 million. If we experienced kind of a worst case scenario, a 50% increase in our allowance, that's a $25 million increase in our allowance. So we've got a $75 million allowance, right? If you tax affect that, run it through your capital calculation, the impact was surprisingly small. I mean, it was like 25 basis point reduction in our Tier 1 capital. Not that bad. We earned that back in less than 2 quarters. I'm not saying I'm not at a regulators conference, but it's not as bad, I think, as you might think from a capital perspective, that implication. So, I mean, and now they're giving us, 3 years to kind of phase that in. So I'm not too concerned about that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for your attendance.